And they were very short. They're brilliant actors and they're quite short. And
well, maybe we want to pick up.
Start from the beginning, and I'll pick up here.
Well, we talked about this at the beginning. So, I think then, many years later, in New York, we were talking about doing some work together, and Lee, a producer, had asked him to come see a piece with
people.
Yeah, it wasn't the greatest piece, but Lee came home from it, and there were three actors who were good, who were all of short stature. And Lee said, I don't think I've ever seen a classical play with three actors who are dwarves. Sometimes you'll see someone do Puck or The Fool, and he's like, I wonder what you do. What? So we started talking about it, and Shakespeare, no, because Lee had done his huge Lear, and Chekhov, no, and then Lee goes, Ibsen. And we both go, oh, Ibsen. And I said, John Gabriel Borkman, because that's my favorite Ibsen play. And Lee goes, no, a dollhouse. And it just was one of those moments where you just knew it was just...
It was lucky connects.
What year was that?
2001. And like the next week, actually, I got a call from my parents. My father was going to want to know if we wanted to go hiking in Norway, and it was like perfect. And then, as the way that Lee often works on things, we had to beg, borrow, and steal, and got a little bit of money, and then wait a long time, and then beg, borrow, and steal some more. And we did the first workshop at New York Theater Workshop. And then I think a year later, we were at...
No, the point I was trying to make was that the idea wasn't mine, it was Brecht's, and it was I don't think this is on. Oh, okay. It was a brilliant alienation device that put things in balance. And I had always been fascinated by Brecht theory and was very interested in some of the directors that tried to mix aspects of Brecht with aspects of Stanislavski, and wanted to give it a try here. And the point was that the Brecht production, the aristocracy was characterized in reverse to their power. They were the shorter they were, the more powerful they were. All the soldiers were over 6 feet, and all the soldiers were, meaningless against these two tiny little cartoon figures who were leading the armies. And what was really brilliant about it was that they resembled Disney cartoons, the way Alphidius and Coriolanus were characterized. Brecht's point here was that he was trying to make a great tragedy into a great comedy, and I think he succeeded. And it was one of the finest experiences I'd seen. And the brilliant thing about it was that you immediately got the message as soon as you looked at the cast standing against each other. So we tried to do the same thing with Dollhouse and just move the idea of characterizing the aristocracy to characterizing the patriarchy. And I thought we had the added advantage of the gender issue here too, in terms of power. So we could just amplify the statement through the gender issue along with the height issue. And but it was basically a classical alienation, Brechtian alienation idea, and we continue to evolve with this. So I would say that this production owes the most to Brecht theory. And this attempt to combine Stanislavski and motivational acting with Brecht theory. I really have learned more and more and more about the style that I was trying to put together, and I've done with other pieces. And I think that it combines many different things. There's a very clear attempt to combine expressionism with surrealism in terms of performing ideas. And the expressionism was basically materialized in the kind of Brechtian acting that you saw at the Berliner Ensemble later. It's kind of Fritz Lang style acting in silent films. It's quite brilliantly done. It's not high melodrama and waving your arms around American style silent films. It's very, very sophisticated in that you know who the character is, even if they don't say a line of dialogue. You know who the character is, what they feel, and what their attitude is the second you perceive them on the screen. It's just a combination of movement, expression, this and that, and physicalization of the message that the character is getting. But I think this connects up with the Brechtian idea that the actor is supposed to comment politically on the character they play, so that you find an actor not necessarily embedded in Stanislavski realism, but commenting on the political and social aspects of their character. And this was, the more I looked at our dollhouse today, the more I realized that an attempt to render the style was what we were really trying to do. The other thing we tried to do was, one of the problems the only major problem I found with Brechtian technique was that they tried to alienate things, but they didn't have anything to alienate. You didn't feel, you know, Brecht was worried about you feeling too much. And so, because he had a lot of hysterical melodrama and a lot of, in certain kind of European classical styles that he was parodying. But, what it got down to it is that he was making commentaries on stuff that really had no juice in them. So what we tried to do is to produce something to alienate, which was very, very, very melodramatic acting that was completely motivated. That you basically understood, it was felt, it was just pure melodrama. Without, sometimes parodying melodrama style and sometimes actually becoming emotionally melodrama. And then, when you pulled back and you distanced yourself, you got a comment because you were commenting on something. It wasn't a meaningless, I hate to say that in this atmosphere, but academic, exercise that you were trying to make a social comment because you were. And so that's basically what we tried to do. And we found out a lot of really interesting things with this, which is, in some of the comedy, the idea of switching instantly from a melodramatic moment to a comic moment. That was a very interesting thing to try because it meant that you had to be a good motivational actor and then be able to suspend that and be a comedian, which is a technical technique. You can't really feel and be able to feel the comic beat. You feel the beat and you produce melodrama. You take the comic take on it and you produce a commentary on melodrama. One's technical and, and one's emotional. And to be able to switch from one to another, you basically, in order to act that way, have to be a little bit skitsy. So the more schizophrenic the actors were, the better. But I was very lucky, and I found Maud and I found, Mark Pofanelli, two very schizophrenic, wonderful actors, and we had a lot of fun together.
Yeah, maybe Maud, since we talked about your work, certainly it almost feels like a role of a lifetime or a career-defining role. Tell us a bit about the journey.
Well, when Lee first said Doll's House, as much as I knew it was a really great idea, I said, oh no, please, I don't want to do her. I don't want to do Nora. I mean, I was born in 1960. I went to college in Oberlin. Feminists a long way back, and that feeling of having to live with this material and revisit this material, I didn't want to. But I think oftentimes when you don't want to do a role, that can either mean don't do it, or it can mean do it. And in this case, I feel like I grew up with her. Sort of, I mean, we worked on this, I call it my dollhouse decade, essentially. I grew up with her artistically and learned a tremendous amount from working with Lee and then from traveling all over the world with it. And I do think it's one of the great journey parts in the Western canon, absolutely.
Yeah, and also so brilliantly directed and also so wonderfully acted. It felt almost like a dance. It was like a mechanism we saw. I just want you to know, looking at this, there was a second production we talked about a bit earlier, very famous productions from the Schaubühne Berlin, which is a great state theater in Berlin, highly subsidized. Kurfürstendamm Ostermeier.
With plenty of money.
Yeah, and Ostermeier, also a very, very great director who kind of termed also the phrase of capitalist realism in theater. He said, I want to show the capitalist realism, how things. So he did also Dollhouse, and I think in some of the festivals, because they were on the same festivals around the world. It was a Bauhaus-like set, of a modern, naturalistic, beautiful, almost like a Hampton apartment. But it was very, very different. So the idea, that kind of radical idea, I just want you to know that Lee had to say, let's do this play almost like a grotesque, expressionistic film, comedy, melodrama, but make it very serious. And I don't know if you noticed, but I felt one could hear every word of what was said, which is very rare, especially for a classic, because the actors were not standing in front of the text, they were a bit behind. Brechtian and also Heiner Müller always said, the problem with big theaters is that the actors want to show, they kind of own, the text. Look, we like a Hermes bag or a scarf. We worked so hard, and now we are here, and we are such great actors. We are so very good, and they stay in front of the text. But actually, what you have to, that was their ideas, you have to be in the back. Don't stay inside. Present it, comment on it. And I think this is a absolutely brilliant work in that sense. There were radical also the differences between the translations that were used next to that style and of acting, the set design. Also, tell us a bit. What was your idea?
First, I just wanted to say that the Schaubühne, I always pronounce it wrong, but it is definitely one of the, I'd say, top 5 most funded, well-funded theaters in the world, you think? Right up there, right up there. Some years back, there's an Australian scholar who started a project mapping the entire production history of A Doll's House, starting in 1879, and has made these maps where you can see every production that's ever been done. I don't know how they keep up with it, but at the time when we finished, the Schaubühne's production was the most toured in the world history, and we were the second most. And I think it's pretty incredible because, Mabou Mines is on a
small
lick and a prayer, and they're just, and to see this map, and that we've touched down in 5 continents was very, with the translation question, what we decided to do was, we looked at 6 different translations. We listened to it in the Norwegian. Anyone who's doing Ibsen has to do a translation now because he wrote in Dano-Norwegian that doesn't exist anymore. We looked at the original text, and then we also commissioned a platform translation for parts of it, which is, that's a different question, but what Lee really wanted to do was to lean into the Victorian nature of when this first came out. And so we really leaned heavily into that first English translation by Archer. And
this is the one that Ibsen, I think, actually looked at the Archer translation and okayed it, did he not? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's not, Ibsen is so often so badly translated, which is, I think, one of the reasons why we have a certain perception of him. So we did counterbalance the Archer with some of this platform translation, and the actual listening to it in Norwegian was very important to hear the rhythms. And
the whole key to a lot of the stuff was, we have a theory that we work with of oppositions, that things are usually in balance. That, for example, if you use a very flowery Victorian translation, the balance to that, in other words, the idea is to produce an element of irony. The balance to that is to have a short-statured actor working in a very Victorian way say these words. And the more flowery, the better it works. This is an opposition that you'll see in silent comedies. And I think it's part of Brecht theory about how to keep these different qualities balanced. The idea is simply that you can't have truth without irony. You have to have both. The truth is double. That, you feel something in deep, and unless there is an ironic relief to it, it doesn't really feel ultimately real. So going ahead with that, these balances become critical. So as soon as you have a very melodramatic moment, you have to put a puppet press reviewer in there who says merde and stalks out of the theater. So, these little touches. The idea about turning, this was tragedy into comedy also. This was bourgeois realism, and this was supposed to be bourgeois tragedy.
We might tussle around with that, because that's great. We started in some ways with that premise, but then after having, that Toril Moy book and thinking about him as the writer of Peer Gynt, it's...
Yeah, you have to look at Ibsen and you can't say this is the guy writing just straight so-called bourgeois tragedy, very pedestrian things. He's underneath it all, there's a wild poet, and there's a surrealist, and there is a high formalist, and so you can't dive into Ibsen and come out empty-handed. You dive in and you find another layer, and we kept finding these
because of the way that Lee works, we kept
so
on
that we could go into dreams, we could go into surrealism, we could try different formal devices, and we find that they would kind of fit because he was big enough as a conceiver to allow for these. Wasn't frail at all.
And I think that that's part of what made it very satisfying to continue to work on it. I think when you actually add together all the dates that we had, it was the equivalent, I think I did the math once, of a 6-month, commercial run. But we did it over the course of 8 years. And so we'd go away, and then you'd come back, and then you would, because it always needed to be subtitled, there was also what it was like to work with the translator from each country and to revisit the text again. And because Lee's pieces never freeze, it was changing and evolving.
We kind of revised it all around the world. Every time we went to another country, we put in revisions.
The film is filmed right smack dab in the middle. I guess if you said we worked on it a year before, so this is like four years into the process. And we were worried that we would film it before we knew enough. And there was a possibility that we were going to film it a year prior to this. And thank heavens that fell through. I think we caught it at a right wave. But then we did continue to learn the next 4 years. But then there were a lot of cast changes, which is a different kind of learning. But it was really, and we were meticulous with the text. We've talked through each line in this, and we would return to the line when she says, when Nora says, I want to say something, just to give you an example about translation, but if Torvald could hear me. And in the original Dano-Norwegian, that line literally means death and pain. Is that Lisa? No, sorry. I thought that was like Lisa Harris. I was like, wow. The original producer. And it means death and pain. But it's always translated as something like, God damn it, or kiss my ass, and it's like we couldn't find something that was right. And I was like, Lee, can I just say death and pain, or can I say it in Norwegian, or it's like, no, we got to find something. And
that's when we came up with Hell's Bells, and it kind of worked.
You give away the punchline. Which is that I went to this international Norwegian scholar conference, and I like cornered about like 6 of them and said like, how would you translate this? And they all went, don't know. I was like, great. But I had bought this like Norwegian dictionary, and one day I was just reading it for fun, looking through, and came across something that said death and, pain and death, archaic phrase meaning hell's bells. And I just thought, he is so funny. Ibsen is so funny, that's so perfect. But then imagine trying to translate that around the world, and each time you had a discussion about it. So there would be an awareness, like when we were in France, I would have an awareness of the original line, death and pain, death and pain, and then the hell's bells, and then I would know what the subtitle was, which in that case was God's stomach. And it's like this very strange layering.
Yeah, also why I wanted to point out the translation is very often translation of international work, especially if it's a bit older, it's ironed out, it's pre-chewed and it sounds nice so everybody can understand it and nobody has to think about it. This original strangeness, the foreignness of the language, the mystery of it shines through. Sometimes you say the yes and no, even. So you were incredibly respectful in a way to the text and then on the other hand, what you did with it was completely, disrespectful, but honest to it. And I think this kind of, Brecht once said, if you're not able to think in contradictions, you are actually petit bourgeoisie. You have to do this. This is how life is, and that's what we do in theater. Tell us a bit about that, of course, the most famous scene of the play, when Nora has this transformation. Tell us a bit how you got to the idea, what you see, how you see it, and what it meant. Both
this was one of the, this is a classic dilemma, in doing Doll's House, what to do with sitting down in the kitchen and talking it all out in the last scene. Is it anticlimactic? Of course it is. It's horribly anticlimactic. What do you do with that? This is when that whole last dialogue that you heard as an opera. And so the big idea was, how do you cap something that we got that far? How do you cap it? So the idea was that the only way that we could really go one up above the style and underline this correctly was to go to, opera buffo, which is what we did. And then luckily we had this wonderful score from Yves Buklarian, fine composer who worked with us. But working back, the way the music was introduced, the piano playing all the way through, you mentioned that it was like a dance. Well, that was an attempt to indicate, to look at it as dance, to say this is a dance, that all of this phrasing has basically a musical composition to it. And if you saw that a lot of the short-statured actors were actually very good movers, and they did little dances. Particular Krogstad, when he was, kind of having his big scene with Nora, it was all, which helped to reinforce the Victorianism of it all. And so the dance element of it really contributed, and the piano was the key to allowing that to take place. Without having that base of formality of the piano score over it, you couldn't dance. It was just, you just couldn't get into a step. You couldn't basically decide. And the idea of dancing it basically produced an irony on it, so that you actually were, able to make fun of the style, as well as, really render the style theatrically, in a very kind of pure way. So it served two purposes at that time.
And I think it became more danced as time went on. I actually kept on thinking to myself, like, why am I still so tired when I do this part? And then I would look at the tape and I would see that it's like something, Lee actually, we kept on making it more complex as time went by. It became more physically demanding, which kept it challenging. But about the ending again, that was one of the places where we had, because it was like my second question to Lee, oh my God, how are we going to do that ending? And he said, well, if I knew, then I wouldn't need to do the piece. So
He's come to you in opportune moments if you pray. You know, so.
pray. But we did ask for a platform translation for that section in there, and right around where I'm dismantling myself, in the stage direction, there is an allusion to bloody, amputated stumps. And that gives you license to go far. And we were working in rehearsal, actually, with Nora, with bringing in, who played the original Christine. And we also have a very early Ivar here, Rachel, who I think was with us when you were like 5 or 6 at St. Anne's. And Ed, our sound designer. Yeah. But wonderful sound designer who taught me a lot about mics. But remember that Nora was at her mother's doll that she would bring into rehearsal. And of course, it's like that classic thing, don't work with a prop if it matters to you because it will break. And yes, we broke her mother's Victorian doll, and the wig was always coming off. And that wig always coming off, we kept that. And then there was some point in there when we were talking about that moment, and it just seemed
That's where
clear.
taking the wig off came from.
But that's
so.
where. And then I
To the doll.
said, well, but if I take the wig off, then I'm going to have hair underneath, and I think I need to shave my head. Didn't know we'd be doing it for so long. I always knew how long it had been since we had done Dollhouse by how long my hair was. But then it turned out that, gosh, that's a lot easier than having hair. And so,
Yeah, the shaved head, you know, was really pretty critical because it comes to the question, how nude can you get?
well,
know,
and
I
that
mean,
was one of the things, because at St. Anne's, I just took off the wig. And then I said to Lee, but God, it's the corset that feels like should come off. And I didn't want to take off my skirt. And I took off the corset at Spoleto. And then after a couple of nights, I said to Lee, is it really stupid that I take off the corset? I still got the skirt on. He goes, I was waiting for you to figure that out.
Yeah, it is really a moment where from that kind of Victorian to that expressionistic film acting, and all of a sudden it was so contemporary, so real, and so you really took the audience by the hand into a journey to where it all ended. And I saw it, and I think many people saw it. It's really truly one of the great theater works, and so strong, the dolls in the background when it all of a sudden opens up. But tell us a bit about the ideas of the set, but also the dolls.
Well, one of the tricks that I kind of learned hanging around, what? You know, Mabou Mines kind of grew up in the conceptual art world, you know, when it was part of Soho, you know, in the late 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And, you know, conceptual art, the idea that you had to have an idea and the art was the idea, became quite important and permeated a lot of my thinking with theater. So that, I lost my train of thought a little bit.
The idea of the dollhouse.
Yeah.
And the stage design, that concept.
Well, once we had the idea that power was reversed in the metaphor, which the shorter you were, the more powerful you were, then that shrunk the decor also, so that the dollhouse itself became the ideal of society's, you know, structure at this particular point. That was the perfect house. That was the mansion. The dollhouse, and also the idea in the film when we decided to make the audience the dolls. This was, I think, a completion of what I would hope to have gotten in the theater production, but wasn't able to make the audience the dolls there, which was that basically this was the idea of live actors performing for pieces of wood. Seemed to make a lot of sense to me in terms of the concept of Doll's House, which was that Torvald and Nora were destroyed by societal strings being pulled, as if they were puppets in society, and that basically it was a world of puppets pulling their strings and making them conform to the ethos of the puppetry and the rules of the puppetry. They had to adopt puppet morals. They had to, deal with puppet behavior. They were controlled. Their morals were puppet morals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that the idea of the decor being a dollhouse was just an addition to the idea that this was doll world. This was a complete doll world, but Power World was a doll world. If it would be the same as if we took a metaphor like technology today. If power was technology today, just think power was miniaturization then. It's just a different metaphor, but it works exactly the same way because the technology metaphor is just about total today. And the miniaturization model would have been the same then. It's just a metaphor to understand the forces of power and the way they interacted, and an interpretation of Ibsen at this point, a non-realistic, a more metaphorical interpretation of Ibsen. So that's where the dollhouse set came in. And yeah. And of course it had to be counterpointed by a very great big piano. I think it was 4 extra octaves that we had on that piano. And
truly, it was a quite, as Victorian houses always seem sometimes like doll houses themselves, and actually in their architecture reflect all of it, what you say, but the way you did it in this cinematic, sometimes even grotesque and melodramatic, it felt surreal, even though the cups were so tiny, and there were more cups, and if they had a real cup, they looked more like real cups. So, but before we come to questions, maybe since we have you here, Lee, tell us a bit about your idea about theater. First question: what is the first memory you have of theater?
My first memory was that I got petrified seeing Dumbo, when in the scene where the elephant was chained and Dumbo was losing his mother was chained, and I had to be taken out of the theater by my father. And I'll never forget that. That was I got scared.
Like a movie. The first memory is a movie.
Yeah. What happened is I kind of grew up in LA, and movies were the metaphor. And I went to UCLA, and I wanted to try to get into the film department, and I couldn't. And I had to, play around in the theater department and pretend it was the film department. So I was writing things that would be more like films and thinking more like films. And then a lot of my work since then has been a way of making the theater filmic. That's why I was so interested in this style of German acting that I saw, that I connected up with the style of Brechtian acting, which I figured was the perfect combination of theater and film acting, with this kind of Fritz Lang style, silent acting that represented physically everything so much. I just, looking at how the two things work back and forth, and I think this is the kind of thing that film students completely miss. They're given a level of realism that they're trying, or practically documentary realism that they're trying to accomplish, and they don't know what it means. I mean, style can be anything. Why not put the thing upside down? That's just as easy. It's just another way of, it's just another worldview. So that the formal choice becomes a more important one, and this is thanks to some art ideas of the turn of the century.
And since you said conceptual art, film, so you speak in a way a lot of languages. You're a poet. I'm sure you're close to poetry. But what does theater really mean for you? Where do you see it? What is the role in the times we live in? What is theater about?
Well, I'm kind of go along with, who was the writer? It's not Turner, it was, well, kind of a Guy Debord fan. Yeah, I'm a kind of a Goffmanite, you know. So I think that I kind of look at pretty much everything as a theatrical manifestation or dynamic. And I think that for example, in finding the dynamic, all you do is have to find the frame. So you're basically looking how you're framing, you know, the world outside, and then you basically look at what the dynamic is, and then you put it together. Now, the key is how you put it together, because, you know, that's when you kind of fall apart. You know, people are very tricky about how they frame things and very tricky about, you know, how they use their dynamics, but when they put it together, they're Aristotelian, okay? You know, this is why I'm kind of hot for Brecht, because he did counterpoint the Aristotelianism. You know, I mean, to be able to have to deal with a critical establishment that tells you that unless your work is Aristotelian, it's meaningless, which is 99% of all the criticism that I've ever read, you know, recently, and certainly, you know, criticism of commercial works. You know, you've got to, you know, get socked with ideas that are right out of the poetics. They're good ideas. They were good ideas then, but there's other ideas. This is why I was so excited by this little Orson Welles film that Eric and I happened to catch called F for Fake, which Orson felt was one of his greatest films, if not his greatest, which means greater than than Citizen Kane. I tend to agree because it's a brand new idea. It's an essay film. And what was incredibly exciting about that, when it was an essay about something that was really meaningful to me. In other words, what creates value in art? And what creates value in art is exactly like the quantum world. You have to observe it. And it's the observer that creates the value. It's not the artist that creates any value. It's what somebody says about it. There's a famous quote of Jimmy Cagney. It says, "You're only as good as people say you are." Well, that's true. And art is only as real as people say it is, or as valid as people say it is. So the entire creation of value is in the hand of criticism. To critique a work is to attempt to devalue it or value it. So this becomes kingmakers. And in this sense, the kingmaker either makes the artist or kills the artist. Perfect example are Wells and artists like Tennessee Williams, who were both made and killed, you know, by critics. And so when you have this syndrome going, you feel, what are they playing? Well, the only people who create you and kill you are gods. So basically, there you have it. And is criticism God? Who knows? But in the quantum world, it probably is, because of the observation is what creates the reality of the, you know, of the little
observable universe. You're right. Before we come to some questions, what are you working on now? What will we be able to see?
Eric and I have a partnership in which we're doing 2 films, of which you saw little pieces of it today. The film about Clarence Fountain, a kind of a Fellini-ish documentary in which we take off away from documentary realism, and a film of the piece that I recently did at La Mama, La Divina Caricatura, which is a puppet version of Dante, from the point of view of a dog. And yeah, and then we would like to finish Guignol. So it's those 3 things.
And is the theatrical project or a play there?
The
Next to
Guignol
those,
is a
let's say we have
project.
But what are
the other 2 are filmic. And
what do you have in mind? Like things we don't know yet, or what are you dreaming about?
Well, I'm hoping to finish a book. You know, so that's.
There's Lee has written this wonderful, it's like a riff on Alice B. Toklas, the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, and his is the autobiography of Bernard L. Dickman. And it's about 25 pages. It's like very multi-layered and incredibly funny, but very moving. And we just recently have started working with Paul Candell on that.
So a lot of these things I got to simplify a little bit because it's hard to keep track of them. But there's 5 projects that I feel really, really lucky in that these projects are things that I'm really, really interested in, that I, were given my eye teeth to be able to have before I had to think about making a living. And now I'm not thinking so much about making a living and thinking about doing these wonderful projects that I just want to keep enough energy to go ahead and do them, because now's a chance I have to do exactly what I want to do. The Bernard L. Dickman project, it's like a send-up of Alice B. Toklas, which I like very, very much. And so it's a combination of writing more and getting more involved with film in partnership with Eric here. So the theatrical projects are spaced in between rather than just one theater project after another. The one at La Mama was enormous. That was an attempt to do a work in bunraku, the Japanese puppet theater, which I've always been fascinated by. And we are attempting to make a film of that, and hopefully that will take place. So it's the magic world of will it get funded? It's just as simple as that. You pretty much just are in the hands of what can be paid for.
Sure. Good. So let's have some questions. It's a little bit of time. So let's say 3 questions. 1, is there another one? Not yet. So we start maybe with your.
The audience for me in the piece made me feel like you were creating a production and the audience was the actual first audience that ever saw the play. And there was something about that for me that enhanced the whole experience.
Yes, I love that.
Thank you.
It's kind of the image that I wanted to get.
Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you for the whole day. It was fabulous in many ways.
Yeah, let's thank Frank. Yeah, this was incredible. I never expected to have, be given a retrospective. It was kind of great. And to be able to see some of this old work and then see the new work, I realized that I was moving different. That old work was heavier and more abstruse than I remembered it. Yeah, and I got a little bit more, epic as I was going along.
Now, I have a question at the end, but first of all, I want to also thank you for opening up Ibsen to us in many, many magical ways. And what I saw, having seen it on the stage and having seen it in this film form, is that you kind of capture the importance. It's very faithful in many ways. It's like a homage to Ibsen as well. And I've seen the Schaubühne too. And you also capture, through the William Archer, I think, the kind of scandalous success that it created in the beginning and how impactful it was. Like, James, you see Molly Bloom in Nora as well, the way you read it. And Brecht wrote that wonderful essay, 3 Cheers for Ibsen, as well. And you have both traditions at work there, I think, and that's wonderfully magical. And I think I might be mistaken in this, but I think Ibsen did rewrite the ending, didn't he? He did have Nora leaving, or is that a myth?
I think it's a myth.
Wait,
Second. I'm the dramaturg.
There are a lot of endings there, particularly some Nazi endings.
I mean, when it was done in Germany the first time, the lead actress refused to do that ending. And copyright laws, Ibsen was one of the people who pushed for who helped improve the strength of copyright laws. He couldn't prevent her from making up her own ending. And because she was going to do her own ending, he said, then I'm going to write it, so at least I'll have written it. Well, of course, when they did it, what all the reviews said was like, oh, how terrible. It's so stupid. She doesn't leave. And she herself said, oh, I really made a mistake. I should have done that. But that's why that one. And then, of course, many other people have written a variety.
My favorite ending, I think I saw some images of a Nazi version of the ending in which they go off skiing at the end, something. Yeah.
Hello. I was wondering if you could talk about the tarantella scene. That was one of my favorites when I read the play, and where she finally cuts loose and gets yelled at for it. And I was wondering how, what you interpreted from that scene.
We went through a long process of, I mean, that, of course, is the metaphor for the whole piece. And you know, Shaw, it was Shaw, I think, who said to him, don't you think that that tarantella was just a bit too much? And we did a lot of research. I looked at it a lot, the way it had been handled. Famously, Dusa doesn't dance at all. She just like drops her tambourine and sinks into the chair. And then Meyerhold, when he has her sort of running, almost like in it, I think. For a long time, we held off on we weren't sure what we wanted to do. And then Lee invited Martha Clark in, and she came in with her little dogs and spent a couple days with us, and then someone worked with us. Originally, the stage version was more acrobatic, I think. Essentially, like Torvald at one point, and he used to climb up on my shoulders, and that was really hard to do. And it kept evolving. We wanted a nightmare quality to it. It was one of the places in the film that we lost some of the footage. What was the question? It was one of the things that kept evolving through the years. And I'm not sure if we ever fully got what we wanted. But one of the things when we were putting the sound on this film was that the sound editor we were working with, we talked about wanting animal sounds that were really terrifying. So he started playing all these different animal sounds. And that actually is the sound of a lynx. It was so horrifying.
I don't know, it's just what my thought process was, that, I really felt that it was, the original tarantella was supposed to be a dance that village women did after they got bit by a tarantula. And in a way, it was a St. Vitus dance, and it was a catharsis. And I think that it was considered at that period incredibly erotic. So the idea is that, that it's very manipulative on the part of Torvald, that he basically wants, Nora to dance an erotic dance for him in front of everyone at this party, very publicly, to turn them on, which is why he's so turned on when he gets back, when he's drunk. And the idea that we wanted to represent was to abstract, an erotic experience in terms of this dance, and show that Nora, objected to being manipulated this way, and at the same time felt that she was trapped into doing the bidding of her husband, and that this was the metaphor that he you know, that he had in mind. This is why he wanted her to dance. This is why he wanted her to dance this way, and why he wanted her to dance this dance. This was, you know, the equivalent of saying, you know, I want to bring my wife to the party. I want her to do a pole dance publicly. You know, it just is, it was, you know, and. So it had all of these elements of eroticism and pain and, I mean, everything that was juicy for the Ibsen moment, you know, eroticism and pain and out-of-control sexuality and seduction. And I'm sure what he wanted to build was a big melodrama moment out of it. And the tarantella was kind of perfect. It was its traditional representation at that time. And that's what it meant to everyone who heard the tarantella, that it was about eroticism, period.
Yeah, and then since it was a dance piece and you directed it as a highly choreographed dance or fight, or however one will see it, you know, big stage fight, you know, it was only fitting that is so central also in it, in his fantasy. He fantasized her, that's the way Northern European wanted their women to look like the gypsies or the others. But I think we are running out of time. Normally we have to be out here by 9:30, and we are still here. But I thought it was just a fascinating day and an overview of a life's work, and where you see really lines and visualizations and connections over 3 decades or 4 decades. 4 decades. So it's been an incredible privilege for us to show it, but also to have you here and for all of you to listen to one of the masters in chess. He would be a grandmaster. Yeah, an American grandmaster of the game. So thank you all, and maybe if you have, can you say 5 or 10 more minutes? If you have some little question, maybe you can talk. But then we, unfortunately, will have to get out here again. Thank you for being here, but also thank you for staying. We need good theater, but we also really need good audiences and people who are interested. So thank you for taking time out of your life to come.